My name is Hazel Warren, and I'm 34 years old. The night my relationship cracked didn't happen during a screaming match or a dramatic confession. It happened quietly on a Tuesday while I was loading the dishwasher and my phone buzzed on the counter behind me. I remember that detail because I can still hear the clink of a plate against the rack when I turned around and saw his name on the screen, not a missed call, just a message. Short, careful. The kind of message people send when they've rehearsed it 100 times and still don't know how it's going to land. Can we talk tonight? At that point, I thought my life was settled in the dependable, unremarkable way people are told to want. I'd been with my boyfriend Jeffrey for 8 years. No kids yet by choice, or at least that's what I told people. A stable job, a shared mortgage weekend dinners with his parents where his father liked to lecture everyone about money, while casually reminding me that they had helped with the down payment. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd won. Inside, I'd been shrinking for years without realizing it. Jeffrey had always been confident to the point of arrogance. When we met in our mid-20s, I mistook that for strength. He walked into rooms like he owned them, spoke over people without apologizing, laughed at his own jokes louder than anyone else. His parents adored that about him, especially his mother Margaret, who treated Jeffrey like a flawless extension of herself. Margaret had a habit of giving advice that was really just judgment wrapped in a smile. If I didn't immediately agree, she'd glance at Jeffrey and say things like, "Well, some people just aren't very adaptable." Early on, I learned my role in that family. I was the reasonable one, the calm one, the one who should compromise because Jeffrey was driven. If Jeffrey snapped at me, it was because he was passionate. If I pushed back, I was being sensitive. His father, Richard, liked to pat my shoulder and say, "Strong men need understanding partners," as if it were wisdom instead of a warning. I dried my hands, glanced down the hallway toward the bedroom, and felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that had become background noise in my life. That sense that something was off, but if I ignored it long enough, it would settle back into place. Dinner that night was quiet in a way that felt staged. Jeffrey picked at his food. I asked about his day. He gave short answers. When we finished eating, he didn't move toward the couch like usual. He stood at the table, arms crossed, eyes fixed just past my shoulder. He said my name the way people do when they're about to change everything. Hazel. What followed didn't come all at once. It never does. First, he said he felt stuck. Then he said he hadn't felt seen in a long time. Then he said he'd been talking to someone who made him feel alive again. When I asked who, he hesitated just long enough for the answer to land harder when he finally said it. A woman from work, someone I'd heard about in passing. Someone whose jokes he'd repeated at dinner without ever mentioning her name. He didn't cry. He didn't apologize. He spoke like he was presenting a case, not confessing. He said it wasn't serious, that it just happened, that I shouldn't overreact. When I asked if he'd cheated, he sided like I was being dense. I don't like that word. I sat down slowly, my legs suddenly unsteady, while he kept talking. He said he didn't want to end our relationship. He said he loved me, but love wasn't enough anymore. Then he said the sentence that still echoes in my head sometimes when I'm alone. Maybe we should open things up, explore. Lots of couples do it. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the life we'd built. I asked if this was something he'd thought about before getting involved with her, or if it was just a convenient solution afterward. That was the first time he got angry. He accused me of making it about blame, of being controlling, of not understanding modern relationships. When I said I wasn't comfortable with an open relationship, his expression hardened into something colder. "You're being selfish," he said. "You're holding me back." And then casually, almost offhandedly, he added, "Honestly, Hazel, it's not like you'd find anyone better anyway. You should be grateful I'm even trying to make this work." Something inside me shifted then, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly like a door closing. At the time, I didn't know it yet, but that was the last moment I believed my silence was keeping the peace. The days after that conversation were worse than the conversation itself, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. Jeffrey moved through the house as if a decision had already been made and I was just lagging behind, emotionally slow to update. He acted like the ground rules were settled, and all that remained was for me to adjust my expectations to match his new reality. He stayed out later. When he came home, he didn't bother explaining where he'd been. His phone, once left face up on the coffee table, was now always angled away from me, screen-locked notifications muted. There was no attempt to hide it, just an assumption that I had no right to ask anymore. When I did try to talk to clarify what open actually meant, he rolled his eyes and told me I was overthinking it, that this was why people didn't grow. Too much fear, too many rules. I told myself I was being patient, reasonable, that if I didn't escalate, things might de-escalate on their own, that if I gave him time, he'd remember the life we'd built together instead of chasing a version of happiness that didn't require accountability. What I didn't realize then was that patience only works when the other person still sees you as an equal. By the end of the week, his parents knew. Jeffrey never kept anything from his mother when he wanted reinforcement. Margaret called me the morning after our conversation, her voice warm and concerned, in a way that immediately put me on edge. She asked if I could stop by that afternoon to clear the air. No question mark. Just a time. I sat at their kitchen table while Margaret spoke about growth and compromise, about how Jeffrey had always been ahead of his time emotionally. She told me relationships evolved, and clinging to outdated expectations only created resentment. Richard chimed in, occasionally nodding gravely, reminding me that long-term partnerships required sacrifice, especially from the more grounded partner. No one asked how I felt. No one asked if I was okay. The assumption hung in the room, unspoken, but heavy. My job was to adapt. Jeffrey's discomfort was treated like a problem to be solved. Mine was treated like an inconvenience. When I went home that evening, the house felt smaller. Jeffrey was on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up when I walked in. "My mom said you seemed defensive," he said casually. Like that was the real issue. That night, lying beside him while he slept easily, I stared at the ceiling and replayed years of moments I'd brushed off. Every time he'd dismissed my concerns as insecurity. Every time his parents had reminded me, subtly politely, that I wasn't the one with leverage. This wasn't just about another woman. It was about years of being told in 100 small ways that my comfort mattered less than his fulfillment. And the worst part was realizing how long I'd believed them. A week later, the situation sharpened into something I couldn't ignore anymore. Jeffrey came home unusually cheerful, dropped his bag by the door, and said almost brightly, "Oh, by the way, I invited someone to dinner tomorrow." I already knew who he meant. "I figured it's time you meet her," he added. "I don't want this to be awkward forever. We're adults." I stood there with my keys still in my hand, staring at him like he'd started speaking a language I didn't understand. When I didn't respond immediately, he finally looked up, irritation flashing across his face. What he said, "You're going to have to get used to this version of me." That sentence landed harder than anything else he'd said so far, not because it was cruel, but because it was final. That night I barely slept. My mind replayed old moments through a new lens. Every compromise I'd made to keep the peace. Every time I'd swallowed something that hurt because it seemed easier than fighting. None of it had bought me respect. It had just taught him how far he could go. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. I reread emails without absorbing them, checked my phone too often, half expecting another line to be crossed. Around noon, Margaret texted me. "Dinner tonight will be good for everyone. Growth happens outside comfort zones." When I got home, Jeffrey was already dressed. Not overly so, just enough to send a message. He'd done his hair the way he used to when we went out together. He noticed me noticing and smiled, clearly pleased. "She'll be here at 7, he said. "Try to be nice." I asked him why he was doing this, really doing it. He sighed like I was exhausting him. "Because I refuse to hide my happiness to protect your feelings." At exactly 7, the doorbell rang. Jeffrey moved quickly, almost eagerly, to open the door. When he did, he laughed in a way I hadn't heard in months, open, unguarded, familiar. Standing there was the woman, confident and relaxed, as if she'd rehearsed this moment and decided she belonged. She smiled at me like we were meeting under normal circumstances. "Hi," she said. "I'm glad we're finally doing this." I forced myself to nod, to step aside, to let them into the life that was already slipping out of my hands. Dinner hadn't even started yet, and I could already feel something fundamental shifting, something irreversible. If I'm honest, the worst part wasn't that Jeffrey brought his ex-girlfriend into our home. It was how easily he did it. How natural it felt to him, like this was simply the next logical step, and I was the only one who hadn't caught up yet. Her name was Rachel. She carried herself like someone who had already decided she wasn't the villain in this story. Confident, polite, almost disarmingly calm. She complimented the house the moment she stepped inside. Her eyes moving over the furniture, the walls, the small details Jeffrey and I had chosen together as if she were taking inventory. Jeffrey lit up beside her, eager, animated, telling her how we had made the place our own. The word we hung in the air, heavy and misplaced, like it was testing how much it could get away with. Dinner was a slow, methodical humiliation. They talked about work, about mutual acquaintances I barely knew about, inside jokes that didn't include me. Jeffrey told stories that carefully edited me out of his life as if I were a background character he'd already outgrown. Rachel laughed easily, touching his arm when she did, just long enough to be noticeable, just subtle enough to be deniable. Every time it happened, Jeffrey didn't pull away. He leaned in. At one point, Rachel made a comment about how complicated people made relationships these days, how exhausting it must be to cling to labels instead of just following what feels right. Jeffrey smirked and glanced at me. I felt my face heat, but I said nothing. I focused on my plate, on chewing slowly, on not giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. Somewhere in the middle of the meal, I realized that silence wasn't protecting me. It was entertaining them. When I excused myself to the kitchen, I told myself it was just to get some water. But once I was out of sight, my feet stayed planted. I didn't mean to listen. I just couldn't move. "She'll come around," Jeffrey said casually, like he was talking about a schedule change. "She always does." "You sure?" Rachel replied. Her voice lowered, not whispering, just unguarded. "She looks like she's struggling." Jeffrey laughed softly. "She needs me more than I need her." Something cracked inside my chest, then not loudly, not in a way that demanded immediate action. It was deeper than that, like a fault line shifting after years of pressure. I stood there gripping the counter, breathing slowly, committing those words to memory. When I went back to the table, I told them I wasn't feeling well and excused myself for the night. Jeffrey barely looked disappointed. He just nodded and told me to rest his attention, already drifting back to Rachel. From the bedroom, I could hear them laughing. The sound carried through the walls long after the dishes should have been done, long after any decent pretense should have ended. I lay there staring at the dark, listening to the life I thought I had dissolved into something unrecognizable. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in how to erase someone while still sharing a home. Jeffrey stopped pretending this was temporary. He openly scheduled his time now. Some nights he didn't come home at all. Other nights he did, smelling like unfamiliar perfume, acting like I was an inconvenient roommate. When I tried to talk about boundaries, he accused me of being dramatic. When I asked for clarity, he said I was creating tension. His parents doubled down. Margaret invited me over for coffee and spoke to me with the kind of manufactured concern that made my skin crawl. She suggested therapy, not for us, for me, to work through my jealousy. Richard told me I should focus on my career instead of micromanaging Jeffrey's personal growth. Every conversation ended the same way. This is just how the world works now. What hurt most wasn't just Jeffrey's behavior. It was how quickly the narrative shifted. Somehow I was now the obstacle, the one refusing to evolve, the one creating conflict. Jeffrey started using language he'd picked up online: emotional labor, unsafe energy, weaponizing it to justify everything he was doing. Then came the money. One evening, he mentioned casually that he'd moved some funds around. I asked what he meant. He said he'd opened a separate account just for independence. When I asked how much he'd transferred, he waved it off. "Don't worry about it," he said. "It's not like you were doing anything with it." That night, I logged into our joint account, or tried to. The password didn't work. When I reset it and the numbers finally loaded, my stomach dropped. A significant portion of our savings was gone. Not a mistake, not a small amount. Enough to matter, enough to change things. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. "I'm protecting myself," he said. "I don't know how this is going to turn out. I need to be smart." I asked why he hadn't talked to me first. He rolled his eyes. "This is exactly why." I called Margaret, still clinging to some foolish hope that she'd see reason. She didn't. She told me Jeffrey had every right to secure his future, that as his partner, I should support that. When I reminded her the account was joint, her tone sharpened. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before you started resisting change." Around that time, Rachel started coming over more often, sometimes even when Jeffrey wasn't home yet. She'd sit on the couch, scrolling through her phone like she belonged there, barely acknowledging me. Once she asked if I could move my car so she could park in the driveway. She said it politely. Jeffrey backed her up without hesitation. The breaking point didn't come in a single explosive moment. It built layer by layer until the weight of it became unbearable. It came the night I received an email from a lawyer I didn't recognize, informing me that Jeffrey had initiated a post-relationship agreement review. Not a discussion, not a conversation. Paperwork, strategy, preparation. That night I waited until he came home. I asked him calmly if he was planning to leave me. He paused, considering, then said, I don't know. But I'm not going to let you hold me hostage while I figure it out. I asked about the house. He smiled, confident, assured. My parents helped us get it, he said. You really think they'd let me lose it? That was when I understood this wasn't just betrayal. It was coordination. Once I understood that what was happening wasn't accidental, everything felt sharper. The house, the conversations, even the silences all seemed staged, like I was living inside a plan that had been drafted without my knowledge and set into motion long before I was invited to have feelings about it. After that night, Jeffrey stopped pretending there was any uncertainty. He moved through the house with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was inevitable. He no longer asked if I was okay with anything. He informed me. He scheduled his life openly, sometimes announcing it as he walked out the door, sometimes not bothering at all. When I questioned it, he accused me of trying to control him, of clinging to a version of the relationship that no longer existed. Rachel's presence became more constant. She didn't knock anymore when she came by. She let herself in with the spare key Jeffrey had given her, the same one we used to leave hidden for emergencies. She'd sit at the kitchen island scrolling on her phone sometimes, commenting on things she thought we should change in the house. Once she mentioned that the spare room would make a good nursery if we rearranged a few things. She said it lightly, almost joking, but her eyes flicked to me afterward, measuring the impact. Jeffrey didn't correct her. Money became the quiet weapon. I noticed bills being rerouted. Statements that used to come to our shared email suddenly disappeared. When I asked, Jeffrey said he was streamlining things, making life simpler. He said it the way people say something reasonable enough that questioning it makes you sound paranoid. When I pressed harder, he told me I was fixating on details instead of focusing on the bigger picture. The bigger picture apparently was me getting out of the way. I started documenting things then, though I didn't fully understand why yet. Dates, amounts, comments made in passing that didn't sit right. It wasn't strategic at first. It was instinctive. Something in me knew I was going to need proof later, even if I didn't know what kind. One afternoon, while Jeffrey was out, I tried to access another shared account and discovered it had been locked, not frozen locked. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the screen, feeling something close to panic rise in my throat. When Jeffrey came home and I confronted him, he didn't even pretend to be sorry. I told you, he said calmly. I'm protecting myself. I asked him if he thought I was a threat. He shrugged. People change. That was the moment I stopped expecting fairness from him. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 a.m, my phone buzzed. A bank notification. Another transfer. Larger this time. My heart started racing as I opened the app, trying to make sense of the numbers through the fog of exhaustion and disbelief. Before I could fully process it, another notification appeared, not from the bank. A message from an unknown number. Hey Hazel, this is Rachel. We should probably talk. There's something Jeffrey hasn't told you yet. I sat up in the dark, the room suddenly feeling too small. My phone glowing like a warning I couldn't ignore. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too badly, and I knew that anything I said in that moment would give her power or confirm exactly what they wanted me to feel. Unstable, emotional, reactive. Instead, I lay back down and stared at the ceiling while Jeffrey slept beside me, completely at ease, as if he hadn't just drained our account again, as if my life weren't being quietly dismantled in the next room. By morning, I felt hollow, not angry, not even sad in a way that came with tears, just empty. I went to work out of habit, drove on autopilot, nodded when people spoke to me. Around noon, my manager pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. Apparently, I'd missed a deadline. I almost laughed. Of course I had. This was bleeding into everything now. That afternoon, Rachel texted again. This time the message was longer, more careful. She said Jeffrey had meant to tell me, but things got complicated. She said he'd told her our relationship was basically over months ago, that he didn't want drama, just transparency. Then she added the sentence that finally gave all the chaos a shape. Also, I'm pregnant, and yes, it's his. I read that message over and over until the words stopped looking real. My first reaction wasn't anger, it was relief. Relief that the confusion finally had an explanation. Relief that I hadn't imagined the distance, the contempt, the planning. Relief that I could finally stop wondering what I'd done wrong. That evening, when I confronted Jeffrey, he didn't deny it. He didn't even look ashamed. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded, expression calm. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to stress you out, he said. It's early. Things can still be handled maturely. I asked if he'd ever planned to tell me. He shrugged. I assumed Rachel would bring it up eventually. like it was a scheduling issue, not a life-altering betrayal. That night was the lowest point of my life. Not because he cheated, not even because she was pregnant, but because I finally understood how he saw me, not as a partner, not as a person with agency, but as a problem to be managed until I stopped being inconvenient. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch until morning, replaying every compromise I'd ever made, every time I'd chosen peace over dignity. Somewhere around sunrise, something hardened inside me. Not rage, resolve. The weeks after that night blurred together in a way that still feels unreal when I think back on it now. Time didn't move forward so much as it dragged itself sideways, heavy and resistant each day, marked by the same dull awareness that the life I thought I had was already gone and everyone else seemed to know it but me. Jeffrey moved into the guest room, though he rarely slept there. Most nights he was gone. When he did come home, it was late, quiet, and efficient. He didn't look at me the way people look at someone they've hurt. He looked at me the way people look at an unresolved task, something that still needed managing. His parents stopped pretending to be neutral. Margaret called to inform me, not ask that they had spoken to a lawyer, and expected me to be reasonable about the next steps. Richard suggested I stay quiet to protect my reputation, reminding me that these things had a way of getting messy if emotions were allowed to run the show. Every conversation came wrapped in concern, but carried the same message underneath. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Jeffrey started referring to the house as his in conversation. Not directly, not yet, but in the way people test ownership before claiming it outright. I'm thinking of repainting the living room. We might need to look at different furniture arrangements. When I pointed out that we'd chosen things together, he shrugged. Things change. I stopped correcting him. That was the first real shift, even though no one noticed it at the time. I stopped explaining myself. Stopped trying to be understood by people who had already decided I was the problem. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't try to prove how unfair this all was. I simply went quiet. Jeffrey didn't like that. He accused me of being cold, of being passive-aggressive, of making things tense for no reason. He said I was acting like I was planning something. He said it half jokingly, half wary, like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or watch his back. I smiled and told him I was just tired. In truth, I was exhausted, but not in the way he meant. I was tired of asking for fairness from people who benefited from my silence. Tired of negotiating my own worth. Tired of believing that endurance was the same thing as love. The appointment with my lawyer felt like admitting defeat, even though it was the opposite. I remember sitting in that office with my hands clasped too tightly, explaining everything in a flat, detached voice, as if I were describing someone else's life. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said something that rewired the way I saw everything. "You're not powerless," he said. "You've just been acting like you are." That sentence followed me home. What Jeffrey and his parents hadn't counted on was how little attention they'd paid to the details. Some of the money Jeffrey had moved wasn't just joint savings. It was tied to accounts I'd opened before we were together, accounts his parents didn't know about, accounts Jeffrey had never bothered to fully understand because he assumed I was disengaged from anything financial. The assumption that I was passive had worked in my favor without me even realizing it. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I focused on myself in small, unglamorous ways. I gathered my important documents and moved them into a safe deposit box. I changed passwords, email, banking, cloud storage things Jeffrey didn't even know existed. I started running again in the mornings not to get fit, but to burn off the constant hum of adrenaline under my skin. I stopped answering Margaret's calls. I stopped responding to Richard's texts. When Jeffrey tried to bait me into arguments, I kept my responses short and neutral. That unsettled him more than anger ever had. The less I reacted, the more he pushed. He needed me emotional. He needed me loud. Without that, he didn't know how to position himself. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Once the shock settled, work noticed my focus. A project I'd been sidelined on suddenly landed back on my desk. My manager asked if I'd be interested in taking on more responsibility, more visibility. I said yes, without hesitation. Saying yes felt different now, lighter, cleaner, like I wasn't asking permission anymore. I reconnected with people I'd drifted away from over the years, friends who didn't demand explanations, who didn't tell me how I should feel. One of them said something one evening over coffee that stuck with me. "You look lighter," she said. "Like you finally stopped carrying someone else's expectations." Jeffrey noticed the changes too. He started watching me more closely, asking questions he'd never asked before: where I was going, who I was seeing. When I told him I had plans, his expression tightened, like I'd broken an unspoken rule. Rachel, on the other hand, grew bolder. She started treating the house like it was already hers, talking about renovations, about the future, about the baby. Once she referred to me as the situation while Jeffrey was in the room. He didn't correct her. I didn't react. The real shift came the day I received confirmation that one of the transfers Jeffrey had made weeks earlier had been reversed. Perfectly legal, perfectly documented. When Jeffrey realized what had happened, he stormed into the house, face flushed phone in his hand, demanding to know what I'd done. I looked at him calmly and said I protected myself, just like you did. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate response. He stared at me like he was seeing a stranger, and maybe he was, because the version of me he'd relied on, the one who stayed quiet, who absorbed the damage, who prioritized peace over dignity, was already gone. That night, he left in tears, called his mother, called Rachel. By morning, Margaret was texting again, softer this time, talking about mediation, about fairness, about family. I didn't reply, because by then I wasn't rebuilding out of desperation anymore. I was rebuilding with intention. And somewhere deep down, I knew Jeffrey and his parents had no idea how much ground they were about to lose. A week later, the balance shifted. Not loudly, not in a way that announced itself. It happened the way most irreversible things do, quietly through a channel I almost didn't open, because I assumed it wasn't meant for me. The email arrived late in the afternoon while I was at work, buried under routine notifications and meeting reminders. The subject line didn't stand out at first. It wasn't dramatic. No legal letterhead, no urgent language, just a forwarded chain with a name I didn't recognize and enough corporate formatting to look boring. That was what made it dangerous. I opened it out of habit more than curiosity. At first, it didn't make sense. There were names, dates, bullet points. Phrases that felt oddly familiar but out of place: timeline optics, voluntary exit. I scrolled back up and realized what I was looking at wasn't a single email. It was a conversation, an internal chain that had never been intended to leave a very small circle of people who thought they were being careful. Jeffrey, his parents, their lawyer. My name appeared early in the thread not as a person, but as a variable. The plan was laid out with chilling efficiency. Stall me emotionally. Normalize the overlap with Rachel by framing it as growth, not betrayal. Drain shared assets gradually, under the guise of independence. Encourage me to feel isolated and unstable. Let me believe leaving was my idea so the house would remain uncontested. There were notes about how to speak to me, what language would calm me, what would provoke me, how to avoid pushing too hard too fast. One line written by Margaret made my stomach turn. Hazel prefers peace. She won't fight if we don't corner her. I stared at the screen long after the words stopped moving. The office around me faded into background noise, the hum of printers, distant conversations, someone laughing down the hall. It all felt artificial, like I'd stepped out of real life and into a set where every interaction I'd replayed in my head suddenly made sense. The dinners, the lectures, the way Margaret always spoke for Jeffrey. This hadn't been impulsive, it had been choreography. I didn't cry, I didn't shake. I closed my laptop slowly and sat there, hands resting flat on the desk, feeling something settle into place inside me. Not despair, not rage. Clarity. That night I didn't confront Jeffrey. Not immediately. The old version of me would have. She would have believed truth demanded exposure, that confrontation was the same thing as resolution. The new version understood something far more important. Leverage only works if the other side doesn't know you have it. I printed the entire email chain the next morning and handed it to my lawyer without commentary. He read it once then, again slower the second time. When he finally looked up, his expression wasn't sympathetic. It was impressed. They overplayed their hand, he said, and they underestimated you. From that moment on, everything became deliberate. We didn't rush. That was the key. People like Jeffrey and his parents thrived on momentum, on pushing situations to a breaking point where reactions replaced strategy. So we did the opposite. We slowed everything down. I stayed in the house. I didn't argue about it. I didn't threaten. I didn't explain. I simply existed there calmly, methodically, documenting everything. Dates, times, financial movements, every instance of Rachel being there overnight. Every message from Margaret suddenly softened now that money wasn't flowing one way anymore. Jeffrey oscillated between panic and contempt. One day he accused me of sabotaging his future. The next he asked if we could reset the tone and talk like adults. I gave him nothing polite responses, neutral expressions, no emotional supply. It drove him crazy. Rachel didn't help matters. Once she realized I wasn't leaving, her confidence turned brittle. She started pushing Jeffrey harder, pressing for timelines, asking when I'd be out of the picture. I could hear their arguments through the walls, sometimes his voice tight with frustration, hers sharp and demanding. One evening, I overheard something that confirmed everything. "You told me she wouldn't fight," Rachel said. "You said she'd fold." "She will," Jeffrey snapped back. "She always does." I stood in the hallway in the dark and smiled to myself. Quietly, I started building a support system Jeffrey never thought I'd have. Not mutual friends who'd already chosen sides, but people who knew me before I'd learned how to disappear inside a relationship. Old colleagues, mentors, a former supervisor who once told me I had leadership potential I never seemed interested in using. Opportunities began to line up, a role at work that would require relocation someday. Nothing immediate, just a door unlocked waiting for me to decide when to walk through it. Financially, we got precise. My lawyer filed motions Jeffrey didn't expect based not on accusations but on documented intent and improper transfers. We didn't dramatize. We presented facts cleanly, professionally, every move backed by evidence. Margaret called after she received notice. Her tone was completely different now. No lectures, no condescension, just concern. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. "We all want what's best for everyone." "Misunderstandings happen," I replied calmly, "when people make assumptions." She didn't like that answer. Richard tried next. He asked if we could talk woman to man, then corrected himself awkwardly and suggested coffee near his office. I agreed. Public place, neutral ground. He arrived with the posture of someone used to control and left looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I told him I knew what they'd planned and that I was no longer interested in sacrificing myself for their convenience. He warned me not to burn bridges. I told him bridges only matter if you ever plan on going back. By the time I walked home that evening, the house no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a stage. And for the first time since all of this began, I knew exactly where I was standing. The invitation came the way all of Margaret's invitations did, casual on the surface, calculated underneath. Not a holiday, not a celebration, just one of those gatherings she liked to host when she needed an audience and a narrative. Family, a few close friends, people who already believed Jeffrey's version of events, or at the very least were comfortable not questioning it. Jeffrey mentioned it offhandedly one evening, while scrolling through his phone. "My parents are having people over this weekend," he said. "You probably shouldn't come, given everything." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. The assumption was baked into the sentence, that I would remove myself quietly, that I would make things easier, that I would stay out of the way while they finalized the story without me. "I'll think about it," I said. That answer alone unsettled him. He frowned slightly, like he was recalculating something that had always been predictable before. He didn't press. He just nodded and went back to his phone, but I could feel the shift, the uncertainty. That night my lawyer called. "The timing is good," he said after I explained the gathering. "If you want to put this on record in a way they can't spin later, this is your opportunity." I walked through the house after we hung up, taking in the details I'd once been willing to abandon just to keep the peace. The couch we'd picked out together, the framed photo from a trip that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I thought about the woman I'd been at the beginning of all this, how convinced she was that endurance meant love, that staying quiet was the same thing as being kind. By the time I went to bed, I knew I was going to that gathering. Not to confront, not to explode, but to let the truth surface exactly where they least expected it. Margaret's house was immaculate when I arrived. Not warm, not lived in. Immaculate in that aggressively curated way where nothing is allowed to exist without permission. The table was set like a magazine spread. The guest list was deliberate. People who would witness. People who would remember. Rachel was there too. She sat beside Jeffrey, one hand resting on his lower back like a territorial marker. She looked comfortable, confident, like she'd already been rehearsing her role in this family for months. When I walked in, the room shifted. Conversations dipped. Smiles froze, then reset into something polite and brittle. Margaret's eyes flickered to Jeffrey, immediately irritation flashing across her face before she recovered and smiled at me. "Hazel," she said, drawing my name out. "You decided to come." "I did," I replied evenly. "I thought it was time." Jeffrey looked like he'd swallowed something sour. Rachel stiffened. Richard cleared his throat and gestured for everyone to sit eager to regain control of the room. Dinner unfolded exactly as I expected. Margaret steered the conversation with practiced ease, light jokes, praise for Jeffrey's strength, subtle references to how difficult this period had been for their family. She spoke about resilience, about growth, about how proud she was of how Jeffrey was handling everything. Halfway through the meal, she turned to me with a sympathetic smile. Hazel, I hope you understand how stressful all of this has been for Jeffrey, she said. We're all just trying to move forward in a healthy way. That was my cue. I agree, I said calmly. Transparency is healthy. The room went quiet, not dramatically, not explosively. The kind of quiet where people sense something has shifted but don't yet know how to react. I stood up slowly and reached into my bag, pulling out a folder. No theatrics, no shaking hands, just paper neatly arranged. I received some documents recently, I continued. They outline a plan that was put in motion long before Jeffrey ever told me he was unhappy. Margaret's face drained of color. Rachel's hand slipped from Jeffrey's back. He stared at the folder like it might bite him. I didn't bring this to start a scene, I said. I brought it because I'm done letting other people control the narrative about my life. Richard spoke first, his voice tight. Hazel, this isn't the place for... It's exactly the place, I interrupted gently. You planned this in private. You counted on silence. You counted on me being embarrassed enough to disappear. I opened the folder and slid copies of the email chain across the table. Dates, names, Margaret's words in black and white. Rachel's eyes widened as she skimmed the page. You told me this was handled, she said sharply to Jeffrey. You told me she wouldn't do this. I looked at her, then really looked at her and said, he told everyone exactly what they wanted to hear. Margaret tried to pivot, insisting the emails were taken out of context. Richard demanded we stop and talk privately. Jeffrey accused me of humiliating him on purpose. I listened without reacting, letting the noise burn itself out. Then I delivered the part that actually mattered. I've already filed the appropriate motions, I said calmly. The improper transfers have been reversed. The post-relationship review has been formally contested. And from this point forward, all communication goes through attorneys. Silence fell, not stunned, not dramatic. The kind of silence where people realize a door has closed and they're standing on the wrong side of it. I gathered my folder and added one final sentence. You thought I wouldn't fight because I value peace. What you never understood is that peace isn't free. I was just tired of paying for it alone. I left without waiting for a response. Behind me, the story they'd been so carefully crafting collapsed inward quietly, irreversibly. The fallout didn't arrive the way people expect consequences to arrive. There were no dramatic phone calls in the middle of the night, no public shouting matches, no viral moments of exposure. What happened instead was something far more unsettling for the people who had built their power on control. Everything went quiet. Margaret stopped calling entirely. Not gradually, completely. The woman who once filled every silence with opinions and advice suddenly vanished, as if ignoring the situation might reverse it. Richard sent one brief message about resolving things reasonably. I didn't respond. Rachel disappeared from the house faster than she'd claimed space in it. Apparently, the confidence that comes from stepping into someone else's stability doesn't last long when the foundation starts to crack. Jeffrey, on the other hand, unraveled. At first, he tried anger. He accused me of sabotaging his future, of embarrassing him in front of his family, of turning something private into a spectacle. When that didn't work, he tried nostalgia. He reminded me of trips we'd taken, jokes we'd shared, plans we'd once made. He spoke as if memory itself were a form of currency, something he could trade for forgiveness. When that failed, he tried regret. He said he'd been confused, pressured, influenced. He blamed his parents. He blamed stress. He blamed Rachel, everyone but himself. He told me he missed the way I used to look at him, like admiration were something I owed him and had simply forgotten to provide. I listened, calmly, silently. The legal process unfolded exactly as my lawyer predicted, methodical, unemotional, precise. The house was put on the market. Assets were divided properly. The narrative Jeffrey and his parents had worked so hard to construct unraveled under scrutiny, not because I argued against it, but because public records have a way of telling the truth without raising their voice. At work, I accepted the new role without hesitation. Different responsibilities, different expectations. The kind of opportunity I'd once talked myself out of because it might disrupt someone else's comfort. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't apologize for choosing myself. For the first time in years, I enjoyed silence again. Not the heavy, anxious kind, the kind that feels like holding your breath, but the spacious kind. The kind that lets you hear your own thoughts without filtering them through someone else's needs. Months passed. One evening, long after the paperwork was finalized and the house was no longer mine, my phone buzzed with a message from Jeffrey. It was longer than necessary, careful, emotional. He said he was sorry. He said he'd lost everything that mattered. He asked if it was too late. I stared at the message longer than I expected to. Not because I was tempted, but because I was grateful. Grateful that I could finally answer honestly without fear, without negotiation. I typed one word. No. And for the first time in years, the truth didn't cost me anything. Stop. Part 9. What peace actually costs. People think endings are loud. They imagine closure as a confrontation, a final speech, a moment where everyone understands exactly what they lost. That's not how it happened for me. The real ending came quietly in the way I moved through my days without checking my phone for someone else's approval, in the way I made decisions without bracing for resistance, in the way my life began expanding instead of shrinking. Jeffrey faded into a story I could tell without my voice tightening. Margaret and Richard became names I didn't need to carry anymore. Rachel became a lesson not about betrayal, but about how easy it is to confuse opportunity with entitlement. I learned something through all of this that no one had ever explained to me clearly before. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. Peace is the absence of self-betrayal. For years, I'd paid for peace by swallowing my instincts, by making myself smaller, by believing that endurance was noble. What I finally understood was that peace only becomes destructive when it's one-sided, when it's built on the assumption that one person will always absorb the damage so everyone else can stay comfortable. I stopped doing that. The life I built afterward wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time, that felt like enough.